Let's jump right into this explainer and explore the unvarnished reality of biblical history. We are picking up the story literally right after Abram arrives in the Promised Land. He has just pulled off this magnificent act of obedience, right? Leaving his country, his family, and packing up his whole life at 75 years old for a place he'd never even seen. He gets there, builds some altars, and everything seems absolutely perfect. But then, almost immediately, the narrative takes a really sharp turn.
It brings up this wild, profound question. What happens when the very man God chose to bless the entire world actually fails? One of the things that makes this ancient text so incredibly trustworthy is that it absolutely refuses to airbrush its heroes. We are about to see how the guy God picked was capable of extraordinary faith and ordinary cowardice, sometimes in the exact same chapter. But this isn't just a story about failing. It is ultimately a story about what comes after, and how grace steps in when we fall short.
Section 1. The Descent. Famine in the Promised Land.
Right away in chapter 12, the narrative hits us with this jarring irony. Abram is finally in the Promised Land, but get this, the land can't even feed him. A severe famine strikes. This is Abram's first real test, and it's a brutal one. God's promise was for this specific land, but the reality on the ground is screaming that there is zero food here. Going down to the reliable waters of Egypt makes total sense for survival. Egypt, with its mighty Nile, was basically the ancient world's reliable food bank. But this physical move mirrors a huge spiritual shift. When Abram left Haran for Canaan, God spoke, and Abram built altars. It was great. But here on the road to Egypt, there's no consultation with God, no altars are built, God's voice goes completely silent, and honestly, so does Abram's prayer life.
Section 2. The Lie in Egypt.
As they get closer to the opulent, kind of intimidating Egyptian palace, fear just totally takes over. Abram looks at his beautiful wife, Sarai, and the panic sets in. He realizes the Egyptians might literally kill him just to take her, so he cooks up this deceptive half-truth to protect himself, telling her to say she is his sister. He is putting Sarai in massive danger just to save his own skin. And what's really crazy here is the specific words he uses. Listen to this: "They will kill me, that it may be well with me, that I may live." Every single calculation Abram makes here is driven by pure self-preservation. Sarai's welfare doesn't even enter the chat. Sure, it's technically a half-truth since we learn later they shared a father, but the intent is 100% deceptive. It's that classic kind of lie that lets you convince yourself you didn't actually lie.
And the plan works, exactly as he feared. Sarai is taken right into Pharaoh's house. Meanwhile, Abram profits staggeringly. He basically acquires an ancient world mini-zoo: sheep, oxen, donkeys, camels, plus a ton of servants. He gets incredibly wealthy, but the cost? It's just unfathomable. The very mother of the promised nation is now trapped in a pagan king's household. Abram staked his whole life on a divine promise, and out of sheer panic, he just handed the mother of that promise over to Pharaoh.
Section 3. The Rescue. God protects the promise.
Because Abram's fear put the entire covenant in absolute jeopardy, God has to step in. The Lord strikes Pharaoh and his household with great plagues to rescue Sarai and protect that lineage. And this leads to a genuinely humiliating moment for Abram. Pharaoh finds out the truth, calls him in, and this pagan king actually rebukes God's chosen prophet for a total lack of ethics. He demands to know why Abram lied and risked everyone's lives. And Abram's response? Absolutely nothing. Crickets. No defense, no explanation, no repentance. He's literally just escorted out of the country. The real takeaway here is that God protected his own promise, even when Abram completely endangered it. The covenant didn't just collapse because Abram had a bad day. It's a powerful reminder that the ultimate success of God's plan rests heavily on God's faithfulness and not on our human perfection.
Oh, and before we move on, you have to notice this haunting parallel. Look at the sequence here. A famine strikes the land. They escape down to Egypt, they prosper while they're there, the Egyptians get struck with plagues, and finally, they leave with great wealth. Guys, Abram's failure and rescue is actually the story of the future Exodus. It's playing out centuries early, in miniature. Just a brilliant, mind-blowing structural detail hidden right there in Genesis.
Section 4. The Road Back.
Escorted out by Pharaoh's men, Abram begins a really critical journey back to where he belongs. And this isn't just a geographical road trip from the wealthy famine lands back to the dusty hills of Canaan. This is a profound spiritual return.
He doesn't go looking for some fresh, new start. He goes all the way back to the altar he had made at first. He returns to the exact stone altar where he was last walking rightly with God, and right there he finally calls on the name of the Lord again. His prayer life is officially reignited.
You know, Genesis doesn't give us this dramatic apology scene or a long, tearful monologue of confession. It beautifully, simply shows us that spiritual recovery doesn't always have to be dramatic. Sometimes true repentance is just physically and spiritually walking back to the last place you knew you were on solid ground and just starting again from there.
Section 5. A generous choice.
But the consequences of Egypt do follow Abram. All that immense, newly acquired wealth becomes a huge source of bitter conflict with his nephew Lot. The land just can't sustain both of their massive farming operations. But right here in the middle of this mess, we see a restored Abram at his absolute best. By every rule of the ancient world, Abram had the right to pick the best land first. He's the elder, he's the patriarch, he's the guy God literally promised the land to. But instead, he remarkably yields his rights. He offers to divide land that isn't even fully his yet, giving his nephew the very first choice just to keep peace in the family.
And their approaches here couldn't be more different. Lot looks toward the Jordan Plain and chooses strictly by sight. He sees it's well-watered. The text even says it looked like the garden of the Lord and like Egypt. Lot goes for the most visually appealing option, totally ignoring its ominous proximity to the wicked city of Sodom. But Abram, walking by faith and not by sight, he just peacefully lets it all go.
Section 6. The Promise Enlarged.
The absolute second Abram surrenders his rights, stops grasping for control, and lets Lot walk away with the best-looking real estate, God's voice suddenly returns to Abram with this sweeping command. Think about the poetic justice here. Because Abram generously let Lot lift his eyes and choose what he wanted, God now tells Abram to lift his eyes and look at the open plains. God steps in and says, I'm giving you absolutely everything in every single direction. North, south, east, west, the whole shebang. The promise doesn't just return, it expands exponentially. Before, God promised Abram a land and that he'd become a great nation. Now, it's literally all the land you can see, forever. The promise of descendants becomes completely uncountable, like the dust of the earth. And keep in mind, God is drastically enlarging this promise to a guy who still has 0 children. So how does Abram respond to this overwhelming grace? He moves his tent over to the trees of Mamre and builds yet another altar. He is truly, fully back.
Section 7. Closing prayer. Let's synthesize these historical events with a beautiful closing prayer drawn directly from our source document. It really helps anchor all this ancient history to our modern, everyday lives. We can break this down into a prayer like this. Father, thank you for the honest truth of your word. Seeing that even the heroes of the faith struggled really gives us hope. Thank you that your covenant and promises don't rest on our perfect performance but on your faithfulness. When fear drives us down into our own Egypt, give us the grace to simply return to our altars, the last place we walked with you. And finally, give us the generosity of Abram, empowering us to release our rights and trust you as our ultimate provider.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. We all have those moments, right? Where fear completely overtakes our faith. But when fear drives you into your own Egypt and you suddenly realize you've drifted so far from where you're supposed to be, will you have the courage to just walk back to the last place you stood with God? Will you trust Him enough to simply return to the altar? Think about that as you go about your week.